Thank you for joining today's Achieving Scalable Dynamic Security Across Multi-Clouds with Zscaler and HashiCorp webinar. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent via email to those who registered within 1 to 2 business days. Joining me today is HashiCorp Field CTO, Ray Plosky, and Zscaler Posture Control Field CTO, Guru Pandurangi. In this webinar, we'll cover how Zscaler and HashiCorp can help achieve scalable dynamic security across multi-clouds with zero trust approach. Lastly, please type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll answer those during our Q&A session at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ray and Guru.
Thank you so much, Priya. Okay, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Guru Raj. You can call me Guru. Let me kickstart with with the agenda slide, and with me I have Ray here. Ray, are you able to hear us?
Hi, Guru. Looking forward to it.
Good morning.
Let's jump right in.
Yeah. So let's get started with zero trust, and the good news is that Zscaler and HashiCorp are jointly, building a lot of new innovation around the space. So we're going to cover really about 4 buckets. The first one is the trends in the evolution of the apps, the evolution of security that's following with the apps itself. We'll touch upon the issues and the problems. We'll not go into the nitty-gritty details of, hey, what's the problem in the app building or the app security, but we'll talk largely at a top level. How's the role of a buyer changing? How the tool sprawls are creating problems at both the app layer as well as the security layer. We'll introduce the concept of zero trust. We'll touch upon things where Zscaler and HashiCorp have come together, how we can jointly help you. And we'll go through that particular case. We'll also start touching upon a series of these webinars that will follow through. We'll talk about what's upcoming and how you can learn a lot more. With that, let's get started. Okay, let's touch upon the key trends, and maybe Ray, if you could talk a little about how infrastructure is evolving. Maybe let's start from there.
Absolutely. So if we can advance the slide, Priya. We have seen an advent and changes that we haven't seen in 30 years with the adoption of public clouds. So previously, when VMs came about, they made some massive revolutions and changes on how infrastructure was handled and how we worked on a day-to-day basis with our typical workflows and operating models. And over time, this has even evolved even further with the introduction of containers, the invention of Docker, the establishment of Kubernetes, and even more evolutions such as serverless today, plus serverless and containers, to make a very mixed match of what types of footprints people have within their particular organizations. And whether you still have mostly on-prem, a primary cloud provider, or multiple clouds, either intentionally or by accident, the world is a bit more complicated than what we've seen in the past. So how we break down monoliths and evolve what those applications look like is something you want to talk to, Guru, for a moment or two. Priya, you want to move to the next slide?
Yeah, thank you, Ray. So I think, Ray, you touched upon a fundamental thing about how infrastructure is evolving. But if you look at the app space, it's catching up. Some of my friends talk about this as a jelly bean architecture now, where everything is cloud native, elastic to its core. Here on the screen, you'll see 5 different patterns in app building. I think the first one, most of us we know about, which is cloud native architecture. There's a lot of conversations which Ray touched upon, serverless, containers, Kubernetes. That's coming to the stay. But more importantly, as apps are getting built, it's also getting pushed to development stages, from development stages to production a lot more frequently. So DevOps becomes mainstay for building of these apps. So the continuous delivery, continuous monitoring becomes mainstay. You've seen through many large cloud native apps, be it Netflix, be it Etsy, or various other apps recently been built in the last couple of years as well. they are not just elastic, they're resilient. Security is built right into the entire architecture. It's not an afterthought, it's really as part of the equation. So as we said, there are various gates that are getting built at each of the stages, all the way from the left shift security, including the gates at the app development, the build times, and you'll see that as part of the automated verifications. HashiCorp and Zscaler have jointly come together to innovate in some of these areas as well. But we'll see that as the apps are getting continuously built, operations have changed quite a bit. As operations of these apps are getting changing as frequently as it is, security probably has to evolve as well. And typically, security starts with changing or focusing on the identity. So Ray, maybe if you could add a few words on what's happening in the identity space.
Sure thing. Bria, why don't you advance one slide, please? So in the past, we've seen focus on identities not look like what we have with these new ephemeral systems that are very spiky and scale up and down. Application identities really focus upon when we have many of these microservices that might scale up or be torn down, has to be embedded within those particular services, not just the human being or the account. We need to make sure that we can connect off of networks that might not necessarily be trusted. So in the past, where we had more traditional sets of data centers, which we'll talk to in a little bit, those don't necessarily exist in our new modern day worldview. Our user identities and who is able to access any of these particular instances on the fly when something goes wrong, it's a lot more challenging than it used to be, since we do have, 10,000 instances of a particular cart microservice, let's say. And the ability to be able to connect all these to the various different cloud providers, whether that happens to be on-premise, or if you're using GCP IAMs and AWS IAMs, how do you actually straighten and map those things to one another to know whom is actually able to talk to one or another? So there's lots of different complications with modern identity and the access patterns that are required to be able to connect all these various different portions of the systems. And we break those down into 4 relatively large buckets, and that's machine authentication and authorization, machine-to-machine access, how we can have humans access any of those given machines, and then how can we attest who we are and log in and be able to provide those credentials in order for us to be able to do our day-to-day job. So lots of changes and lots of complexity and many areas that you need to make sure you can manage to ensure that your entire estate is secure. So
that's
Guru,
interesting.
I pass it off to you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think you can see the infrastructure has changed. Well, let's kind of recap, some of the evolution or the trends around us. Ray talked about the infrastructure changes. That's evolving pretty rapidly. Now I talked about the app changes. We talked about the identity and access patterns changing. But the fourth trend is even the end user is starting to change. Instead of we being selling to a buyer like an exec or a CIO, most new tools, are adopted by now the end user itself, right? That either that could be the developer, the DevOps teams directly from the finance teams or the operational folks. You name it. You name it across the board. So instead of large upfront purchases, now consumption-based pricing is here to stay. The distribution channels have changed. So there's really 4 large trends that making the app development to security evolution rapidly changing. So with that, let's quickly get started to where security is changing. So Bria, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, you'll see that. Let's get the slide built out. There you go. So you see that there are really 4 things that are happening in the market, especially when it comes to cloud security breaches. The first one is your attack surface has changed quite rapidly because of the variations in your workloads itself, right? The apps are much different than the apps that were there about 5 to 10 years back. So the attack surface has changed, which means that they can find you through, they can find open endpoints, they can find access into your APIs, or your identity and access protocols might have been breached. Once they're able to find the attack surface, they're able to compromise you. Typically, we've seen compromises around the admin users. You'll see so many breaches because of a weak credential, be it a user or a human credential, or be it a machine credential. You'll see in those patterns evolving pretty rapidly. But once they have compromised at least the top layer of your apps, you hear stories about lateral movement. So those access patterns go and span across your various workloads, and you're spanning your middle tier of infrastructure where the communications are happening, and they eventually land, to your crown jewels, which is your data. That's where they're able to steal your data, be it confidential data, be it your marketing or financial data, PII, or your medical data. That's where that's the source of your attacks, essentially trying to take your crown jewels, which is your data. Well, with that said, you'll see in the market there are some really large, interesting attack patterns. You see supply chain attacks with SolarWinds. There are newer and newer vulnerabilities being accessed, being exploited. Log4j was very new. OpenSSL, that's not on the slide, that's very new. That happened very recently as well. You see some large major attacks on Colonial Pipeline. Many of these are extremely sophisticated attacks, but they follow the same anatomy of the attack pattern. They find the attack surface, they compromise, they move laterally, and they steal your data. Because of these, security needs to evolve. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, and security needs to evolve. And Ray, could you talk a little about how things have changed between before the apps were monolithic, and built in the data center versus the modern infrastructure? How are these things different?
Absolutely. So in our traditional data centers, we pretty much had, to simplify it grossly, would be anything on the outside of our firewalls was bad or untrusted, and everything within is relatively trusted and good. We built up whole systems of tools, technologies, best practices around being able to control our ingress and egress into our data centers and monitor what that looks like by building out firewalls and SIEMs and many other ways to be able to detect intrusion. But logically, that was a fallacy even back then. Large organizations will have bad actors within them, disgruntled employees, sloppy employees. The concepts of being able to have trusted data was not necessarily one thing that we could 100% count upon, but it was pretty good for most of what we needed to be able to do. We can segment networks via subnets in order to keep dev and production away from one another, and pretty much secure our data in a castle and moat type of logical paradigm, so to speak, where we can control everything that comes in, everything that goes out. And for the most part, it was relatively safe. Nowadays, that perimeter is very, very porous. You don't necessarily, whether or not you're using one cloud, multiple clouds, and connecting into your data centers, you don't necessarily have a trusted perimeter. You don't necessarily own that network. We have these systems that Guru was speaking about that's are ephemeral and spike up, systems of engagement that will go from 5 containers to 50,000 at peaks and drop back down again. So we have to make sure that we can trust what their identity is and what they're able to access. And above and beyond that, we're moving data over networks that are not necessarily ours. So how do we make sure that we can ensure our security both with our data in transit as well as at rest? So there's a lot more moving parts that we really need to make sure that we decide to be able to work through with the modern infrastructure and be able to secure that. So moving away from a castle and moat type of paradigm to more like a hotel room where you have access for only a specific amount of time before that key card shuts off and the next guest shows up. So Guru, if you want to add more to that, or we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah. So I think Ray touched upon, some of the core things, but I think as we move around, the primary premises for security challenges have not changed quite a bit. You've seen the rate of increase of risk associated to your apps, is incrementally increasing, year on year. That's not changing. So there's a secular trend around it. The number of tools that end users are using, when we say end users, it's the operations team, it's the developers, the DevOps team, the DevSecOps team. The tools project has increased. Really, with the advent of CNCF, there are so many new tools getting promoted, and you'll see that many of them are getting deployed. HashiCorp itself has a suite of tools, about 8 or 9 odd tools. Zscaler now has about 8 or 10 tools. And you look at the entire security ecosystem, including the open source ecosystems, there's really a tool sprawl, right? We don't have to even name it. It goes into hundreds and thousands of these tools, being deployed for solving really point solutions. What has actually changed is the speed at which deployments are getting done. It's the speed at which value is getting created, and getting in front of the end consumers. So the apps are getting deployed much more frequently. They're updated much more frequently, and because of that, all the other challenges they actually accentuate, right? So because of the sophisticated attack patterns, because your ephemeral infrastructure regulatory compliance is a lot more difficult, because of your apps being varied and very heterogeneous, you have an increased risk at the attack pattern. So that's a very high level summary. But the baseline of that is apps are now very different and they are moving much more faster. So that really calls for a new approach. And Ray, do you want to talk about the new approach?
Sure thing, Bria. Thank you. So we really want to make sure that we can get past. Guru, this is your slide that we'll move one forward if you wouldn't mind. The new approach. Bria, here we go. We want to make sure that we can secure identities across the different types of systems within your estate. And we'd like to make sure that you have the principle of least privilege, so that access is only what you need and when you need it. And we have to make sure that we have this new paradigm. Many of us won't ever return back into a headquarters, that much of the workforce that you will have will be remote. You'll be accessing services in the cloud. Your teammates will be working out of their houses and cafes. And we need to make sure that we can secure who those users and those identities are. In addition, Lambdas and containers and even monoliths still have to have an identity, and workloads that are being moved into the cloud need to be secured as well. Code base, network activity, the runtime, every single particular area, and that one of the 3 pillars that we focus on. The third area is this focuses on securing your infrastructure. The vast majority of exploits happen from poorly configured infrastructure and allowing people to be able to exploit those particular holes. And good examples are things such as the famous Target hack, where they wore drive the HVAC system outside of a store, moved laterally into the store's data center, then into the cloud, and then into Target's data center to be able to exfil everyone's information and then sell it on the dark web. So making sure that we can focus on securing our users, making sure that the workloads that are running are secured as well, and that the infrastructure is very, very configured and tight. Definitely is 3 areas that we think that both Zscaler as well as HashiCorp can help you with. But let's talk a little bit about that. Let's move forward to Zero Trust. Guru.
Yeah. So talking about Zero Trust, and before we actually jump into a little bit of the Zero Trust, here's a question to all the listeners. Ray talked about those 3 areas: the users, the workloads, and the infrastructure. Do you believe that you'd have one tool that can solve all 3 problems? Would you rather have multiple tools to solve individual problems, or would you rather think that there is a platform approach, to really bringing all of these signals together and really helping an end-to-end solution? That's a question to you. You could type and comment, on the slides or on the video. I'm happy to listen to your comments as well. But here's what we think. We've built jointly between Zscaler and HashiCorp. We focused on a Zero Trust approach. Zscaler has been pioneering the Zero Trust approach for quite some time. And what you see on the slide is the bottom, the foundational layer of that is what we refer as the Zero Trust Exchange platform, which is, of course, very cloud native, multi-tenant, very globally available across the world. We partner, we have our own data centers, about 150 plus data centers all around the world. And we partner with larger cloud providers as well, AWS and Azure being the larger providers. And that becomes the foundational platform for us. if you look at the spectrum of the apps and the cloud services that we have built, it's really about those three things. One is securing the users. Zscaler has been known for doing that for quite some time with products like ZIA and ZPA, leading the charge. And over time, you'll notice that we've introduced both the inline apps as well as the API apps. And most of the newer apps are a lot more API-based apps. You'll see in the last 3 years, we introduced CASP and data protection, which solves your secure data access for your SaaS layers, be it Dropbox, be it Box, be it Salesforce, be it any data that's in any of the any of the SaaS data stores. Sometimes also referred as SSPM plus CASP plus DLP into that particular spectrum. We've recently, in the last year or two, we've innovated a lot more in the zero trust for workloads, and that touches upon workload to workload communications, as well as workload to the internet. There's a lot of customers, and that's where we partnered a lot more with HashiCorp on how communications will operate. We built our own, Terraform templates. We become a Terraform provider to make that happen. But the last area that we've been recently, talking a lot, and we are building rapidly towards it is our secure public cloud apps, and that's the CNAPP space, or the cloud native app protection. That goes all the way from left shifting to the right, to securing, at the operations layer as well, which really encompasses the entire SDLC cycle. That's how we believe zero trust could be, and very likely what we are trying to say is that there's a platform approach to solve all those three layers that Ray just talked about. Ray, over to you. Could you talk a little more about zero trust from HashiCorp?
So with HashiCorp, we focus a lot of our time building our products around zero trust and with particular principles in mind. You'll find that we will, in every single one of our conversations, our tutorials, our webinars, our meetups, that we talk a lot about identity-based security. So all services will be identity-based driven. That you have to make sure that you can mutually authenticate one service to another to be able to attest who they are. The ability to have the principle of least privilege. So that means we give people only the amount of access required. This is done through ACLs and policies. The idea that passwords and credentials really shouldn't sit around for very long. I mean, we've seen many exploits done by people simply getting onto your network and looking for your logs to find out what these particular passwords might be, or within your VCS system. So being able to rotate these passwords should not be around as long as leases. It should be around as long as milk on a sunny day, so to speak. The ability to encrypt your data, both when it's in motion as well as when it's stored, so that even if you do have a hacker who does exploit your database schema or wherever you're holding sensitive information, it's relatively worthless for them. And that every single interaction between the various systems should be audited and logged someplace in a centralized spot so that you can go back to determine what may need to happen. And we apply this in our world from the HashiCorp perspectives, from the network connectivity, so how we connect the various different machines or services to one another, how we also connect humans to those machines, and then how we can make sure that we can connect even over the most hostile networks. And this is regardless of whether you're on premise and you're using vSphere, or you're in AWS or GCP, or you're using Kubernetes or OpenShift or otherwise, right? Still should apply to regardless of what you might have within your estate. Priya, can you move forward? And how we do this is we break it down into the HashiCorp portfolio is a set of materials in a stack. So our open source project packer allows you to be able to define AMIs or VMs that you know exactly what's put into it because you're the one doing so, or you're insured about what that software provenance might look like. The ability to have Terraform have policies and ACLs and role-based access control, so only particular people who should be building up infrastructure can. And that policy set in place in a way so that they don't make mistakes and that you can set people up to fall into the pit of success, so to speak, by using the best practices around security and global risk and compliance as part of the checks and balances before the systems are actually pushed into a live production environment. And Consul allows us to make sure that we can register and attest that services are who they say they are and connect them, whether that happens to be a mainframe in a data center to a Lambda, and how one can actually make some explicit controls called intentions over what particular service can connect to another through microsegmentation. For instance, a shopping cart microservice can go and talk to the inventory monolith, but never to the accounts receivable system. And we set this up via names of these given services versus IPs and ports of the days of yesterday. Vault has a double role. Originally, it was built to broker your identity, so your GitHub alias to your AWS IAM or to your Azure Active Directory account or principal. We found that it was very, very easy for us to be able to roll out other given use cases, such as password management, as well as encryption as a service, so that I can specify what type of encryption I'd like and version it over time to make sure that data that we do have from these applications that Guru was mentioning is encrypted and stored in a way that it's secured at rest. And then last but not least, things do break, and they will continue to break over time. This is where Boundary actually comes into play. Boundary allows us to create new credentials on the fly on any given instance and allow an operator to be able to do their job, but not much else. Whether that happens to be one of 50,000 pods that you may have running, or even a database to provide a new set of credentials with access only to the tables within the schema that they need to be able to work upon. So lots of focus from HashiCorp on making sure that we use identity-based security on various different levels, from provisioning to connecting to making sure that we have access for humans that's just in time and just right, that can then be rotated time and time again. So moving on, Bria, why don't we talk a little bit about how Zero Trust maps between both HashiCorp and with Zscaler? Guru, why don't you take this and tell everybody how they can actually marry these two pieces together?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think Ray touched upon some really foundational things again, right? So identity has become the new perimeter. Individually, HashiCorp and Zscaler has been solving many of these problems, at different layers of the stack. Zscaler has been solving problems with the user from a pure inline web proxy for quite some time. Very recently, in the space of DLP, workload protection, there's a lot of things that are coming together. So this is what you see on the screen. In the last 1 year or so, Zscaler and HashiCorp have really partnered to solve some of the most intriguing problems, especially for cloud-native apps. The first one being Zero Trust for the workloads. We believe that connectivity between workloads, be it machine-to-machine identity, be it workload to workload, and however you define the workloads, could be your virtual machine to your database, or could be your service, or a microservice to another subsystem, be it in the same VPCs or be it across the VPCs. So we've innovated quite a bit on secure connectivity between these workloads, secure access between these workloads as well. So that was a first set of a partnership that Zscaler and HashiCorp started off with. Over the last 6 months or so, we've innovated pretty rapidly in the CNAPP space. HashiCorp has been building various Terraform tools and various policy as code kind of agents across the board. We built our CSPM or the misconfiguration layer quite some time back, and we thought that this is a good time for us to come together. So HashiCorp and Zscaler invested quite rapidly into the really 4 different areas, especially in the CNAPP space. The first one is to secure the infrastructure, and that could be your database, your microservices, your Kubernetes cluster with KSPM, with serverless security. Most of that is around identity, including your misconfigurations, as well as your privileged identity permissions. And here's a simple example. Let's say you have 2 users within your corporation. One of them, let's say, is Jenny, and who has direct access to your S3 buckets, versus let's say there's Jeff, who has access through a virtual machine, and now he can access by taking a particular role to the S3 bucket. Most of the tools in the market will say that, hey, Jenny shouldn't have access to the S3 bucket because because of the direct connection to it. But because of this user to machine to machine to machine and machine to a data connectivity, the entire crawl path from the user to the data has to be figured out. And that's where we invested in the in entitlement permissions as well. We focused a lot more on left shifting jointly with the HashiCorp. We built various gate checks at the Sentinel layers or at the Terraform cloud provider layers, and we are able to go solve all the way from build time to runtime because of the because of these faults. Right now, most of these are around misconfigurations and but over time, this will be expanding that to a lot more into network access as well. That's where our partnership has evolved to, and it's going to go much more rapidly as we look into the future. Okay, with that said, let's quickly jump into the next slide, Priya. Okay, to summarize, and I think we jointly believe in really defining zero trust in these three areas. The first one is securing your users. And those users can be your corporate users, your employees, your internal DevOps teams, or your users of your apps. And that users could be, users of your line of business applications or your SaaS applications that are, that are accessing from the outside. So, that's first layer of protection. The second layer of protection is the app itself, and that's where the attack surfaces are problematic. We look at the API security. We look at various layers of the security. Typically, typically with CNAPP innovations, we are focusing purely on the build time to the runtime security, and a lot more of that happens in the secure your app space. That's where your baselines of network access also get figured out. And the third pillar of zero trust, and we believe to be a foundational pillar, is secure your infrastructure. If you don't secure your infrastructure from all the way from things that we talked about, be it identity machine to machine, be it secrets management, be it entitlement permissions, across the board, you'll have problems in accessing to your data. Your data becomes a lot more easily available, for hackers to come in. So those are the three pillars that we think of zero trust. So Ray, how does our partnership help in terms of our joint customers?
So thanks, Guru. You'll find three major areas where you'll get benefits from actually adopting a zero trust approach with Zscaler and HashiCorp particularly. With zero trust, you're going to be able to increase the velocity of your developer experience and productivity. By having secrets that are automated in management and identity-based security, you'll spend a lot less time shipping between ticket tags, so to speak, with lots of folks being requested to be able to provision new types of credentials or principals, and the ability to update and change and rotate even certificates on the fly. You're also going to find that you'll reduce a lot of the complexity by really adopting a platform mindset and having many of these security principles and best practices by default. Everyone's talking about shifting left and more responsibilities on the application development groups. That's great, but the cognitive load for this tends to not be differentiated versus the custom applications they are building that truly provide value for the enterprise or company. So by adopting these platforms, you get many of these given best practices very, very quickly with a lot less complexity, since people are focused on making sure that these tools work well together and within the areas that you're deploying out your systems, whether that's on premise or in the clouds. And the last is, as I mentioned before, many of the exploits that you'll see today are from poor configurations. So by having a zero trust systems that are in constant place that will update your passwords, rotate your credentials, identify and scan your apps, and provide best practices and policies, you'll significantly reduce quite a bit of the risk to your organization. And that can be justified. There's many conversations we do have of what a breach may look like, how much it may cost based upon your risks and regulatory policies that are required for your industry, and how to make sure that you can make a decent investment for your CIOs so that they can maintain business continuity and avoid the breach. So moving on, we'll talk a little bit about the integrations of what we've done with Zscaler as well as with HashiCorp technologies.
Yeah, super. So let me quickly jump into the specific integrations that we've jointly built. Right now, we have 4 different integrations. You can see from all the way from CNAP. We call our product as Posture Control or Zscaler Posture Control. You'll see snippets of that as ZPC. But that's really about IAC scanning, Terraform templates scanned, all the way from your laptops or your desktops where developers are building it, all the way till build to deployment phases. And we have drift detection at the, drift detection between runtime and dev time as well. And we use, our partnership extends or runtime support for Terraform Cloud. We have user-based protection with ZIA and ZPA become now Terraform providers. When customers are deploying ZIA and ZPA, the deployment is much more simpler because of we being a Terraform provider. Excuse me. We're also, I think, one of the top integrations in the Consul Terraform sync modules, and that's for our ZIA and ZPA, products. And with the newer Zscaler Terraform migration tool, we're getting a lot more into infrastructure management. So those are the 4 different integrations. We'll have different webinars on each of these topics. And with that, Ray, over to you for next steps.
Great. So we gave you some high-level trends. We talked a little bit about how both Zscaler and HashiCorp look at zero trust. Talked a little bit about the products as well as the integrations and work that we're doing together to provide a better solution for you. If you want to learn more about how to actually adopt zero trust from HashiCorp, go to hashicorp.com's zero trust site, or go to Zscaler's Posture Control website. And last but not least, if you want to know more about the specific integrations, there's literally a document that talks about what Guru just mentioned with those 4 particular areas on HashiCorp's site. So these slides will be given out in time. And then Guru and I, this is the kickoff of many future presentations where we can get into some more detail specifically around some of these given areas. Guru, you want to talk a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, so unfortunately, this did not make it up into the slide deck, but we'll touch upon those 4 integrations previously we talked about. Probably one of our first webinars will be in a month's time about the ZPC IC Terraform templates. We'll go into CI and ZPA integration with the Consul Terraform webinar as well. So, excuse me, sorry for the cough there. But we'll have about 4 or 5 different sessions in the upcoming months, and we'll have a website, jointly together to start taking registrations towards these webinars. Happy to host them together, and we would love to have that interaction with you on how these integrations are helping you. With that, we'll quickly turn to to a Q&A. Thank you so much for the time taken. Love to know your feedback, on these integrations. Have you heard of them before? How do you think of Zscaler and HashiCorp partnership? We would love to take any questions, from there on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guru and Ray. That was great. So we want to open it up to Q&A at this point. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section. I do have a couple of questions for the 2 of you. So as far as zero trust goes, what are the differences between before and now?
Okay, Ray, you want to take that, and maybe I can add to it later?
Sure. Well, we did highlight a couple of those themes that I want to make sure people leave with around the fact that we're really moving towards identity-based security, specifically with the fact that we have these new paradigms and new primitives in the cloud operating model that we did not have in the past. So we have systems that are systems of engagement that scale up very, very rapidly and are torn back down. that are on machines that we don't necessarily own and on networks that we definitely don't know exactly what's running on them. So I mentioned it before about the castle and moat paradigm. That pretty much falls apart with this new cloud landscape. And so zero trust means you really shouldn't be trusting anyone or anything without proving who they are, and don't trust anything that you're going through at one point in time. And this is really the most major paradigm shift that we've seen, at least when it comes to security, in quite some time. Guru, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, an interesting anecdote. So about a year back or so, there were a lot of conversations that we were having with customers on trust but verify. Right? They were building apps which were automatically granted access to their partners, to their internal development teams, with the modality that you should trust them, but they should have monitoring tools to verify whether those trust parameters are met or not. The new world is on, right? Supply chain attacks are happening more and more, within the organization, not so much externally. Excuse me. So trust but verify is a very costly approach at that time. That's where zero trust approach came in, where you don't trust the other services even within your own network. You don't trust the users. You don't essentially trust your partners, and you put parameters to grant explicit access to them. Excuse me. We'll pause for a quick second.
Thanks, Guru. That was a great response. Punctuated by a sneeze at the end. Bria, are there any other questions?
Yeah, a couple of more. The next one is, how can we learn about zero trust?
So we're vendors, both Zscaler as well as HashiCorp, and we have tools to help you with what zero trust might look like. But there are some principles and best practices that are out there. There's been executive orders about making sure that you harden what your cloud infrastructures might look like. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, based out of the US, provides a really good set of foundational concerns and recommendations for you when you start to adopt zero trust. More than just the tools, it's a mindset and a set of processes and practices. Additionally, there's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, part of the Department of Homeland Security, that talks about all the various different aspects of zero trust. And there's many areas. They have a zero trust pillars, is what they call it. But it's a good way to talk about the capabilities and the competencies and break down this very, very large topic into sizable, discrete areas that you as a customer can focus on to be able to improve your enterprise's security posture. So those are the two areas that I'd recommend that you take a look at, as well as take a look at the zero trust materials that we have on Zscaler and on HashiCorp sites as well. Guru, anything else on that?
Yeah. Sorry for the cough there. It looks like it's catching up with me. You'll find a lot of zero trust, guides across the board, right? Every vendor is publishing its own zero trust, or at least their own view of zero trust. But I think the foundational things you should probably, for the listeners particularly, maybe start with the NIST zero trust architecture. That gives you the definition of what zero trust means in this particular day and age. It gives you those pillars that Ray mentioned about. But then the tools to solve those problems are now, as diverse as possible. And that's where our partnership with Zscaler and HashiCorp is coming to fruition, because that we are solving specific areas and we are going deep and we are going broad at the same time. Happy to send more information your way if you'd send your questions over to us over email or to the or get us in touch from the marketing side. I will be happy to provide more of this information as well.
Okay.
Well, I think that's it.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Ray. I was just going to read the next question.
Go right ahead, Bria.
Okay, so the next question is, how do we approach implementation?
That's where it differs. Maybe Ray, I'll take a quick shot and then you can add a few more things to it. In the last, year or two, you'll see that there has been hundreds and thousands of implementations on each of these three areas: secure your users, secure your apps, and secure your infrastructure. In the infrastructure space, Gartner, Forrester, Microsoft, AWS have their own viewpoints on what areas the cloud providers would secure, what should the vendors secure. There are so many open source tools around, managing some of those components as well. There are commercial tools that's available in the infrastructure space. If you look at the users, on the other hand, Ray talked about is castle and moat, kind of technologies that have been permeating for the last maybe 10, 15 plus years. Those are not solved. In fact, those are becoming hindrances where especially employees and consultants are working remotely. They need access to both their corporate line of business applications as well as externally as well. That's where web proxy, kind of technologies, Zscaler is a leading provider in that, is helping towards it. But if you look at the middle space, which is secure your apps, that's where there's a lot of innovations, mostly because the apps themselves are changing very rapidly. CNCF laid a foundation to the various kind of workloads, the containerization of your typical workloads. Ray talked about it as part of the infrastructure revolution. We've seen that firsthand internally within Zscaler as well as talking to hundreds and thousands of customers. In the last 2 years or so, we were talking to customers who were primarily virtual machine centric, right? And their conversations with us were, hey, how do we secure these virtual machines, especially when they're in the cloud? Typically, when it went from your virtual machines to PaaS services, and agents couldn't be deployed into PaaS services, conversations were very different, right? So it was around the perimeter, the access, the configurations, the identity entitlements, and so forth. But when serverless came into being, when they were not, completely ephemeral, and they existed, they run, they consume some compute, and they vanish away. How do you secure them? So that's where we had a lot of conversations on, is security at the endpoint with the time of the invocation or at the time of deployment? And looks like, that market changed quite a bit, right? So it started with, can we secure the deployment itself? Can we secure the runtime? Or can we secure both of them? So the tools started coming up for each of these areas as well. So we've seen a lot of things in the market. There's tons and tons of tools in GitHub which solves one particular problem, but especially when we talk to the enterprises, it's extremely difficult to stitch them all together. That's where the commercial tools came into being, where many of these things are stitched together, and they're able to share those signals back to the cloud provider, and the cloud providers will take the signals back. In fact, Zscaler announced a deeper partnership with AWS recently at re:Invent as well, where we were able to take our signals and direct it at the data security lake that AWS announced. So some of these signal sharing is where we are learning together as an industry. But I think the second bucket, which is secure your application, that's involved innovating pretty rapidly. Ray, any thoughts?
I covered it relatively well. I mean, we see this on a regular occasion. People sometimes adopt the open source tools as tactical to be able to solve a particular point solution. You see that some success, and then a centralized group will want to be able to institute better security and visibility and policies. And you'll need to start to create a platform team, whether you use our cloud-based products or the self-hosted commercial products. That's where you start to see a lot of the abilities and visibility and security and truly starting to be able to do things such as accounting and auditability. So more intent-driven types of automation of that infrastructure and hardening it until finally you get to the point that you can truly evolve and reap a lot of the benefits and values that we talked about a little bit earlier. I really appreciate everyone taking the time just to be with us here today.
Yes, thank you everyone who submitted questions, and Ray and Guru for the presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar. We'll make the recording available after processing, typically within 1 to 2 days. And we'll send an email out to everyone who registered with the recording link, and it will also be posted on the HashiCorp YouTube channel. If there's no other questions, we'll say goodbye, and thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you all.